Archive X. Cubicle 6 by X. Stelmack.
I'll admit it. I've always been a really sensitive person. It's not that I'm emotionally weak or some kind of drama llama. I've just always seemed to feel things way more intensely than most. And it took me a long time to learn how to control that enough to fit in with regular people. That's why I'd been so stressed out when my job got downsized. That's never a great experience for anyone. But for me, it created so much anxiety, I did nothing but job hunt even though I had a good amount of savings. I was about a month into that when I finally got a call back. A mid-sized company needed someone to handle data entry. Boring work, routine and mind-numbing. But at that point, I think I would have taken anything. I didn't ask questions. I just said yes. The boss, Whitaker, was a decent guy, laid back and polite as he greeted me. The office had that generic corporate sterility, gray walls, fluorescent lights, the faint hum of computers filling the air. But everyone there seemed happy enough as he led me to my workstation, Cubicle 6. Small and slightly battered, identical to the others in the office except for one thing. A small statue that sat in its far corner, tucked out of my view in the corner, till I actually sat down and saw it. It was about 6 inches tall and made of dark stone. A vague, humanoid figure, but grotesquely distorted. Twisted limbs, an elongated head, and eyes that were way too deep and dark and hollow. The very sight of it made my skin crawl. That same visceral reaction of revulsion and horror one might get from looking at maggot-ridden meat or discovering a nest of spiders, only somehow even stronger. I couldn't ignore it, but at the same time I couldn't bring myself to look at it for more than a few seconds, let alone touch it. So I just sat as far away from it as I could in the cramped confines of the cubicle and tried to focus on my work. The effect of that horrid thing began within an hour. As I typed away, I kept having flashes, weird little discordant memories that weren't mine. Memories of wearing a tie I'd never owned, of having a watch on my wrist when I'd never worn one in my life, of eating a lunch I'd never packed. I'd never experienced anything so disturbingly dissociative in my life, and as the morning wore on, it only got worse. I remembered slipping in a huge pool of fresh blood, of my teeth breaking against concrete, of a young woman screaming my name, her face twisted in terror. Only it wasn't my name, and I'd never seen her before. I felt like I was going insane. By lunchtime, my hands were shaking. I barely touched my food. Instead, I found Whitaker in his office. "Hey," I said, forcing a casual tone. "How do you feel about Cubicle 6? He frowned.
What do you mean?
I hesitated. I couldn't exactly tell him I was experiencing. He'd have probably assumed I was on drugs. It just feels weird. Like something's off about it, I said lamely. Whitaker's looked genuinely confused about what I was talking about, but just shrugged after a moment.
Well, no problem. You can just move to Cubicle 8 if you want. That one's empty, too.
I wasted no time in moving my stuff, and though Cubicle 8 was literally just across the aisle from 6, the false memories immediately stopped. For the first time that day, I could think clearly again. The job was actually pretty good. Whitaker and my coworkers were all friendly and helpful. The work was easy, yet required enough focus to make the hours pass quickly. Sure, the place was dreary, but at least it had good air conditioning in the blistering heat of the summer. And having a steady paycheck let me relax for the first time in weeks. Then, a couple of weeks later, a new guy joined us. His name was Jake. and he'd been assigned Cubicle 6 just across from me. I met him as he was setting up his workspace, an average guy about the same age as me. We chatted a little, and as he unpacked, I noticed he had a small bottle of cologne with him in the shape of a swan. The unusual look of it made me ask where he'd gotten it, which turned out to be a gift from his mother after her recent trip to France. We carried on with that kind of small talk, but before long he was unpacked and eager to get to work. I let him be, sure he wanted to make a good impression with the boss. But before leaving, I hesitated, then said, "Hey, just a heads up. If you start feeling weird in this cubicle, just talk to Whitaker. He'll move you." Jake gave me a look.
Weird how?
I struggled to find the right words. Like something's messing with your head. He laughed.
You mean some kind of prank or something?
I forced a smile. Just don't touch that statue, okay? He looked over at the statue like he'd just seen the thing. Whatever had creeped me out so much about it didn't seem to have had any effect on Jake whatsoever. He nodded.
Sure, man.
I left it at that, and for a few hours, everything seemed normal. At 5 o'clock, we all clocked out, and only then did I notice that Jake was gone. I figured he'd just left a little early. No big deal, except the next morning, when I came in, Jake wasn't there, and neither was any of the stuff he'd brought with him, like that bottle of cologne, though of course that nauseating little statue remained. By lunchtime, I was worried. I checked Cubicle 6 again. Still empty. No sign Jake had ever been there. So I asked Whitaker. His brow furrowed.
Who?
Jake, I said. The new hire. Whitaker shook his head.
We didn't hire anyone named Jake.
I laughed, expecting him to be messing with me. I literally talked to him yesterday. Whitaker just stared at me.
We don't have a Jake here. We have a new girl starting next week, though.
I asked my co-workers. None of them remembered Jake. I felt sick. About a week later, Angela turned up, and like Jake was assigned to Cubicle 6, she was plain and mousy and harmless looking. But after what had happened, I was more than a little on edge. I forced a smile and introduced myself. Then an idea hit me. "Hey, mind if I take a selfie with you?" I asked. She raised an eyebrow.
I'm engaged.
She said, holding up her hand to show me the ring on her finger, a gold band inset with a trio of small, twinkling diamonds. "It's not like that," I said quickly, not wanting to get reported to HR. "Just a harmless thing." She looked uncomfortable, but reluctantly agreed. I snapped the picture. Then I told her the same thing I had told Jake. Don't touch the statue. An hour later, I peeked over at Cubicle 6. Angela was gone, along with all of her belongings. I nearly cried out, but covered my mouth. My hands trembled as I pulled out my phone, pulling up the photo I'd snapped. I was in it, but not a trace of Angela. And once again, nobody remembered her. I had to find answers. The next day, I asked Whitaker about the statue, trying to sound as casual as I possibly could. He didn't seem to have any knowledge of it, but simply replied,
Guess that must have belonged to Nachtnebel.
"Who's that?"
Dave Nachtnebel, weirdo who used to work here a couple of years back. Creepy as hell. One of those guys with a decent resume and who did okay at the job interview, but it wasn't long before everyone wanted him gone.
"What did he do wrong?" I asked.
Nothing specific.
Said Whitaker, rubbing the back of his neck.
He just had this presence that put everyone on edge, would stare at people for no reason, made comments that sounded innocent, but the way he said them made my skin crawl. When our budget got cut, I was actually happy about it. Gave me an excuse to lay him off. Guess he must have left the statue behind when he went.
It didn't take long to track Dave down. I managed to dig up his file after hours, and the next day took a personal day to go investigate. The address led me to an incredibly sketchy side of town. The building was old and crumbling, smelling of mold even from the outside, and the street was littered with addicts, every one of whom looked like they'd stab me soon as look at me. Trying the door, I found the lock broken, and heading inside, climbed the creaking stairs to Nachtnebel's apartment. Honestly, I didn't have much of a plan. Didn't know what I was going to do when I found the guy other than try and get some answers, but I wasn't completely unprepared. I'd brought along a crowbar so I could get into his place if he wasn't around, and just in case I needed to defend myself. I'm not a criminal. I'd never broken into anyone's place before that day. But with Jake and Angela gone, I just had to find out what was happening. Who knew how many others had vanished from Cubicle 6 before I came along? Who knew how many more would disappear if someone didn't do something? And when it came down to it, I was the only one who could. Finding his door, I knocked on it, and there being no answer, I put my ear to it and listened. Silence. Seemed like he was out at work. As poor a condition as the building was in, though, that door was solid as hell. Thick wood and fitted with multiple deadbolts. It took me ages to pry it open, but with a loud crack and the splintering of wood, I finally managed it. The place was dimly lit, the windows plastered over with a layer of filthy newspaper, but the walls were lined with shelves. Spaced out on them, almost as if displaying trophies, were all kinds of random objects. But immediately I spied a couple that made my stomach churn. Jake's cologne bottle and Angela's engagement ring. I moved to examine them, but it was in that moment that Nachtnebel, or at least who I assumed must have been Nachtnebel, got the jump on me. I don't remember much. It was all a blur, a sharp pain in my lower back, a violent, desperate struggle. He was strong, frenzied, his face contorted and eyes insane. But somehow I managed to get on top of him and brought my crowbar down on his head. Once, twice, perhaps more, again and again till he stopped moving. Next thing I remember, I was staggering out onto the street, covered in blood, both his and my own. I managed to get to my car and drive to the nearest hospital, though how in the world I got there, I don't know. Apparently, I managed to get through the doors of the emergency room before collapsing from blood loss. One of the few good things about living in a big, crime-ridden city is that people ask amazingly few questions when you get stabbed. The cops didn't even come by to question me, and if they ever found Nachtnebel's body, they didn't connect his death to me. A few weeks later, I was back at work, warmly greeted by my coworkers who genuinely seemed to have been worried about me. I thanked them all and was headed for my desk when Whitaker pulled me aside.
Hey, just so you know, I got rid of that statue you told me about.
I tensed. What? What happened?
Nothing.
Whitaker said with a smile.
Tossed it, and that was that.
I exhaled slowly. Ending Nachtnebel seemed to have also ended whatever power the statue had, and nobody who got seated in that cubicle ever seemed to have a problem after that. I did the right thing. The only thing I could have done given the situation, and I don't regret it. But often I lay awake at night, wondering what exactly that thing was, where Nachtnebel had gotten it, about whatever happened to Jake and Angela and all the other people unlucky enough to have been assigned to Cubicle 6. And I wonder if, somewhere, they're all still alive.
like and subscribe for more horror and mystery stories.